So we are in 2.18. It's called 9 Days. So this picks up right where 17 left off. 17, I know we had talked about skipping, is just Lucy and Dr. Manette hanging out together before the wedding. And so now we're waking up on the marriage morning. And remember, what's the thing that's going to happen that we knew would happen if she married Darnay? So think about that. So it says the marriage day was shining brightly, and they were ready outside the closed door of the doctor's room where he was speaking with Charles Darnay. They were ready to go to church, the beautiful bride, Mr. Lorry, and Miss Pross, to whom the event, through a gradual process of reconcilement to the inevitable, would have been one of absolute bliss, but for the yet lingering consideration that her brother Solomon should have been the bridegroom. So remember, Miss Pross said the only guy that was suitable for Lucy was her brother Solomon, who stole everything from her. This is back in the hundreds of people chapter, 2.6. And so, said Mr. Lorry, who could not sufficiently admire the bride, and who had been moving round her to take in every point of her quiet, pretty dress, and so it is for this, my sweet Lucy, that I brought you across the channel, such a baby. Lord bless me, how little I thought what I was doing. How lightly I valued the obligation I was conferring to my friend Charles Darnay. You didn't mean it, remarked the matter-of-fact Miss Pross, and therefore, how could you know it? Nonsense. Really, well, but don't cry, said the gentle Mr. Lorry. I'm not crying, said Miss Pross. You are. So, they're both, they both sort of have this, like, parent slash, like, grandparent feeling about Lucy, and so they both care about her, and so it's like, I'm not crying, you're crying, like that type of thing. So they're both upset, emotional about the fact that she's getting married. My Pross, by this time Mr. Lorry dared to be pleasant with her on occasion. You were just now. I saw you do it, and I don't wonder at it. Such a present of plate as you have made him is enough to bring tears into anybody's eyes. There's not a fork or a spoon in the collection, said Miss Pross, that I didn't cry over last night after the box came, till I couldn't see it. I'm highly gratified, said Mr. Lorry, though upon my honor I had no intention of rendering those trifling articles of remembrance invisible to anyone. Dear me, this is an occasion that makes a man speculate on all that he has lost. Dear, 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 to think that there might have been a Mrs. Lorry any time these 50 years almost, so he's never gotten married. Not at all, said from Miss Pross. You think there might have ever been a Mrs. Lorry? Asked the gentleman of that name. Pooh, rejoined Miss Pross, you were a bachelor in your cradle. Well, observed Mr. Lorry beamingly, adjusting his little wig, that seems probable too. So I've talked in the past with people about how this is almost sort of like a little flirtation between Miss Pross and Mr. Lorry. You were cut out for a bachelor, pursued Miss Pross, before you were put in your cradle. Then I think, said Mr. Lorry, that I was very unhandsomely dealt with, and that I ought to have a voice in the selection of my pattern. Enough. Now, my dear Lucy, drawing his arm soothingly round her waist, I hear them moving in the next room, and Miss Pross and I, as two formal folks of business, are anxious not to lose the final opportunity of saying something to you that you wish to hear. You leave your good father, my dear, in hands as earnest and as loving as your own. He shall be taken every conceivable care of during the next fortnight. So for 2 weeks, they're going on a honeymoon, and that Lorry and Miss Pross are going to look after Dr. Manette to make sure that he's okay. While you're in Warwickshire and thereabouts, even Tellson shall go to the wall, comparatively speaking, before him. And when, at the fortnight's end, he comes to join you and your beloved husband on your other fortnight trip in Wales, you shall say that we have sent him to you in the best help and in the happiest frame. Now, I hear somebody's step coming to the door. Let me kiss my dear girl with an old-fashioned bachelor blessing before somebody comes to claim for his own. For a moment he held the fair face from him to look at the well-remembered expression on the forehead, and then laid the bright golden hair against his little brown wig, with a genuine tenderness and delicacy which, if such things be old-fashioned, were as old as Adam. The door of the doctor's room opened, and he came out with Charles Darnay. He was so deadly pale, which had not been the case when they went in together, that no vestige of color was to be seen in his face. But, in the composure of his manner, he was altered, except that the shrewd glance of Mr. Lorry, it disclosed some shadowy indication that the old air of avoidance and dread had lately passed over him like a cold wind. So, notice it's always Mr. Lorry that notices this, like, change in Dr. Manette, and he's just come out of this private room with Charles Darnay, obviously what's gone on behind closed doors, right? So, Darnay told him his true identity and the story about, his name and family and all of that. and clearly Minette is impacted, like physically impacted by it. He gave his arm to his daughter. He took her downstairs to the chariot, which Mr. Lorry had hired in honor of the day. The rest followed in another carriage, and soon, in a neighboring church where no strange eyes looked on, Charles Darnay and Lucy Minette were happily married. Beside the glancing tears that shone among the smiles of the little group, when it was done, some diamonds, very bright and sparkling, glanced on the bride's hand, which were newly released from the dark obscurity of one of Mr. Lorry's pockets. They returned home to breakfast, and all went well, and in due course the golden hair that had mingled with the poor shoemaker's white locks in the Paris garret were mingled with them again in the morning sunlight on the threshold of the door at parting. It was a hard parting, though it was not for long, but her father cheered her and said at last, disengaging himself from her enfolding arms, "Take her, Charles, she is yours." And her agitated hand waved to them from a chaise window, and she was gone. So Darnay and Lucy leave on their honeymoon. The corner being out of the way of the idle and curious, and the preparations having been very simple and few, the doctor, Mr. Lorry, and Miss Pross were left quite alone. It was when they turned into the welcome shade of the cool old hall that Mr. Lorry observed a great change to have come over the doctor, as if the golden arm uplifted there had struck him a poisoned blow. He had naturally repressed much, and some revulsion might have been expected in him when the occasion for repression was gone. But it was the old, scared, lost look that troubled Mr. Lorry, and through his absent manner of clasping his head and drearily wandering away into his own room when they got upstairs, Mr. Lorry was reminded of Defarge, the wine shop keeper, and the starlight ride. So clearly, Minette is relapsing. "I think," he whispered to Miss Pross, after anxious consideration, "I think we had best not speak to him just now, or disturb him at all. I must look in at Tellson's, so I will go there at once and come back presently. Then we will take him on a ride in the country, dine there, and all will be well." It was easier for Mr. Lorry to look in at Tellson's than to look out of Tellson's. He was detained 2 hours when he came back. He ascended the old staircase alone, having asked no question of the servant. Going thus into the doctor's rooms, he was stopped by a low sound of knocking. "Good God," he said with a start, "what's that?" Miss Pross, with a terrified face, was at his ear. "Oh me, all is lost," cried she, wringing her hands. "What is to be told to Ladybird? He doesn't know me and is making shoes." So this is like a full-on relapse. He's making shoes. He doesn't recognize Miss Pross or Mr. Lorry. Mr. Lorry said what he could to calm her, and went himself to the doctor's room. The bench was turned toward the light, as it had been when he had seen the shoemaker at his work before, and his head was bent down, and he was very busy. "Dr. Minette, my dear friend, Dr. Minette." The doctor looked at him for a moment, half inquiringly, half as if he were angry at being spoken to, and bent over his work again. He had laid aside his coat and waistcoat. His shirt was open at the throat, as it used to be when he did that work, and even the old, haggard, faded surface of face had come back to him. He worked hard, impatiently, as if some sense of having been interrupted. Mr. Lorry glanced at his work in his hand, and observed that it was the shoe of the old size and shape. He took up another that was lying by him, and asked what it was. "A young lady's walking shoe," he muttered without looking up. "It ought to have been finished long ago. Let it be." "But, Dr. Minette, look at me." He obeyed in the old, mechanically submissive manner, without pausing in his work. "You know me, my dear friend. Think again. This is not your proper occupation. Think, dear friend." Nothing would induce him to speak. He looked up for an instant at a time when he was requested to do so, but no persuasion would extract a word from him. He worked and worked and worked in silence, and words fell out of the air. The only ray of hope that Mr. Lorry could discover was that he sometimes furtively looked up without being asked. In that there seemed a faint expression of curiosity or perplexity, as though he were trying to reconcile some doubts in his mind. Two things at once impressed themselves on Mr. Lorry, as importance above all others. The first is that it must be kept a secret from Lucy, so they're not going to tell her. The second, that it must be kept secret from all who knew him. In conjunction with Miss Pross, he took immediate steps toward the latter precaution, by giving out that the doctor was not well and required a few days of complete rest. In aid of this kind of deception to be practiced on his daughter, Miss Pross was to write, describing his having been called away professionally, and referring to an old imaginary letter of 2 or 3 hurried lines in his same hand, represented to have been addressed to her by the same post. These measures, advisable to be taken in any case, Mr. Lorry took in the hope of his coming to himself. If that should happen soon, he kept another course in reserve, which was to have a certain opinion that he thought best on the doctor's case. In the hope of his recovery and of resort to his third course, being thereby rendered practicable, Mr. Lorry resolved to watch him attentively with little appearance as possible of doing so. He therefore made arrangements to absent himself from Tellson's for the first time in his life. He took his post by the window in the same room. So, kept a secret is the big thing to know from everybody else and from Lucy, but also for the first time ever, Lorry doesn't go into Tellson so that he can stay home and watch Minette. He was not long in discovering that it had been worse than useless to speak to him, since, on being pressed, he became worried. He abandoned that attempt in the first day, and resolved merely to keep himself always before him as silent protest against the delusion into which he had fallen. Let's see. So everything kind of continues as usual. It says on 189 toward the bottom, on the second day, Mr. Lorry saluted him cheerfully, so he keeps going in, trying to act like everything's normal, by his name, and spoke to him on topics that had been of late familiar to them. He returned no reply, but it was evident that he heard what he said and that he thought about it, however confusedly. This encouraged Mr. Lorry to have Miss Pross in with her work several times during the day at these times, and spoke quietly of Lucy and her father, then present, as if there was nothing amiss. This was done without any demonstrative accompaniment, not long enough or often enough to harass him, and it lightened Mr. Lorry's friendly heart to believe that he looked up oftener, and that he appeared to be stirred by some perception of inconsistencies surrounding him. When it fell dark again, Mr. Lorry asked him as before, "Dear doctor, will you go out?" As repeated before. "Out? Yes, for a walk with me, why not?" This time Mr. Lorry feigned to go out when he could extract no answer from him, and after remaining absent for an hour, returned. In the meanwhile, the doctor had removed to the seat in the window and sat there looking down at the plane tree. But on Mr. Lorry's return, he slipped away to his bench. The time went very slowly on, and Mr. Lorry's hope darkened, and his heart grew heavier again, and grew yet heavier and heavier every day. The third day came and went, the fourth, the fifth, 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, 8 days, 9 days. No surprise, that's the title of the chapter. With a hope ever darkening and with a heart always growing heavier and heavier, Mr. Lorry passed through this anxious time. The secret was well kept, and Lucy was unconscious and happy, but he could not fail to observe that the shoemaker, whose hand had been a little out at first, was growing dreadfully skillful, and that he had never been so intent on his work, and that his hands had never been so nimble and expert as in the dusk of the 9th evening. So, the question is, how is Minette going to come back? Who's going to bring him back if Lucy's not there? And that's it.